long before empires rose and fell. Before borders divided the world. Before kings ruled from cities of stone. There was only the steppe. A vast and endless land. Stretching beneath an open sky. No walls. No protection. Only wind. And survival. This was the world of the Seljuq Turks. The people from whom Alp Arslan would rise. Life here was harsh. Winters were freezing. Summers were relentless. Food was uncertain. Danger was constant. But this environment created strength. It created warriors. From a young age, boys were trained to endure. They learned to ride horses, as if they were part of them. They learned to fire arrows, even at full speed. To fight. To survive. They did not fight like empires. They were faster. More flexible. More unpredictable. They could strike suddenly. And disappear just as quickly. Over time. This way of life began to shape history. The transformation began under Turul Beg. He led the Seljuks westward. Into Persia. Into lands of power and culture. There everything changed. They embraced Islam. They gained purpose. They gained direction. They were no longer nomads. They became rulers. Protectors of the Abbasid Caliphate. Alongside him, his brother Chagri Beg secured the east. Together, they built the foundation of an empire. And into this world, Alp Arslan was born. Around the year 1030. He did not grow up in luxury. He grew up in motion. In uncertainty. In preparation. His father trained him. As both warrior and leader. He learned loyalty. Strategy. Control. Because in the Seljuk world, power was never guaranteed. It had to be taken. And defended. In 1061, his father died. Instability followed. Soon after, Turul Beg died without an heir. The empire began to fracture. Rivals emerged. Among them, Kutlumush, a powerful figure, with his own ambitions. War became inevitable. But Alp Arslan acted first. He moved quickly. Decisively. He gathered his forces. Secured loyalty. And struck. One by one. His enemies fell. By 1063. He stood alone at the top. The ruler of the Seljuq Empire. But ruling required more than strength. It required structure. Control. Vision. So he turned to Nizam al-Mulk. A man of intellect. A man of strategy. While Alp Arslan fought wars, Nizam built the state. He organized governance. Strengthened institutions. Maintained stability. Together, they created balance. A conqueror. And a builder. With power secure, Alp Arslan turned west. Toward Byzantium. His campaigns were relentless. Not one massive war. But many precise strikes. Fast. Sudden. Effective. He attacked border regions. Forced the Byzantines to react. In 1064, he struck at Ani. A fortress city. A symbol of resistance. The siege was difficult. But the outcome was inevitable. The city fell. Then came Kars. Another stronghold. Another victory. And with each success, the frontier weakened. Not broken, but cracking. The Byzantine Empire could not ignore this. At its head stood Romanos IV. A determined emperor. A soldier. He saw the threat clearly. And he chose to act. He began to prepare. Not slowly, but with urgency. Messages were sent across the empire. Troops were gathered. Allies were called upon. Weapons were prepared. Supplies were organized. This was not a small response. This was a full campaign. Romanos IV was determined to restore control, to push back the Seljuks, to reclaim lost ground, and to prove the strength of the Byzantine Empire. But beneath this display of power, there were weaknesses. The army was large, but not unified. From different regions, different commanders, with different ambitions. Some loyal, some uncertain, some already divided by politics. This lack of unity would prove dangerous. Very dangerous. While the Byzantines prepared, Alp Arslan was not idle. He understood the situation. He understood the risk. But he also understood his advantage. Speed. Flexibility. Control. He did not rush blindly. He observed. He waited. He planned. At first, his attention was not even fully on Byzantium. He had been campaigning elsewhere, dealing with threats in other regions, expanding influence, maintaining authority. But then, news reached him. The Byzantine army was advancing, large, organized, and moving east toward his lands. Alp Arslan reacted immediately. There was no hesitation, no delay. He redirected his forces. He moved fast, faster than expected, crossing great distances in a short time, because speed was his greatest weapon. The two forces were now on a collision course. The location: Manzikert, a place that would soon enter history forever. As both armies approached, the tension grew. This was no longer a series of raids. This was not a border skirmish. This was a decisive confrontation. The Byzantine army relied on numbers, heavy infantry, armored cavalry, structured formations, a system built for direct battle. Alp Arslan relied on something different: mobility, precision, adaptability. His army was smaller, but more flexible, more responsive, more experienced. In fast warfare, the battlefield was not just a location. It was an advantage. And Alp Arslan knew how to use it. Before the battle began, there were moments of silence, moments of preparation, soldiers checking weapons, commanders giving final orders, men thinking about what was about to happen, because they all understood this battle would decide everything. On one side, a powerful empire seeking to restore control. On the other, a rising force. The first movements began, not with a full attack, but with positioning, observation, testing. Seljuq cavalry moved forward, light, fast. They struck from a distance, arrows flying. Then they pulled back, not engaging fully, not committing. The Byzantines responded, trying to maintain formation, trying to advance, trying to force a direct battle. But Alp Arslan did not give them that. Not yet. His forces continued to move, to circle, to strike. To retreat. Again. And again. And again. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The battlefield became a place of exhaustion. The Byzantine army began to feel the strain. Not just physically, but mentally. They could not pin down their enemy. They could not control the pace. They were reacting instead of leading. Fatigue spread. Confusion followed. Commands became harder to deliver, harder to follow. Small mistakes began to appear. And in battle, small mistakes become big ones. Alp Arslan watched carefully, patiently, waiting for the moment, because he knew every army has a breaking point, and the Byzantines were getting closer to it. The pressure kept building, slowly, but constantly. The Byzantine army continued to move forward, trying to force engagement, trying to regain control. But the battlefield was no longer theirs. Seljuq cavalry remained in motion, never still, never fixed in one place. They attacked in waves, then disappeared, then returned again, from another direction. To the Byzantine soldiers, it felt like fighting shadows. An enemy that would not stay. An enemy that could not be caught. Time passed. Energy drained. Morale weakened. Then came a critical moment. A turning point. As evening approached, the Byzantine army began to withdraw. Not in panic, but in order. Or at least, that was the intention. But in war, intentions often fail. Communication broke down. Orders became unclear. Units moved at different speeds. Some pulled back too early. Others stayed too long. Then to separate. Then to weaken. And Alp Arslan saw it. The moment he had been waiting for. This was it. The breaking point. He gave the signal. Seljuq forces surged forward. Not in scattered raids, but in full attack. Cavalry units closed in from multiple directions. Coordinated. Relentless. Arrows filled the air. Then came direct engagement. Close combat. Impact. Chaos. The Byzantine army could not recover. The withdrawal turned into disorder. Disorder turned into collapse. Then came something worse. Betrayal. Within the Byzantine ranks, some forces refused to support the emperor. Others abandoned the field. The army was no longer united. It was breaking apart. No hesitation. No mercy in movement. The Seljuq forces tightened their hold. Encircling. Crushing. Overwhelming. The battlefield was no longer a contest. It was a defeat. Complete. Irreversible. And at the center of it, the Emperor Romanos IV was captured. Alive. A Byzantine emperor stood as prisoner of a Muslim ruler. The battle was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Romanos was brought before Alp Arslan, a defeated ruler, standing before a conqueror. The moment was powerful, symbolic, historic, and yet unexpected. There was no execution, no immediate punishment. Instead, there was restraint. Because Alp Arslan understood something important. The victory itself was enough. The message had already been sent. The balance of power had shifted, and nothing would be the same again. But the real transformation did not happen on the battlefield. It happened after the battle. Silence returned to the land. But history did not stop. It had already changed direction. The captured Emperor Romanos IV was treated not as an enemy to destroy, but as a political asset. Alp Arslan did not seek revenge. He sought stability. Negotiations followed. Terms were discussed. Humiliation was avoided. And in the end, a settlement was made. The message was clear. The Byzantine Empire was no longer dominant in the East, but the greatest transformation was still coming. And it was not immediate. It was gradual. Invisible at first. Then unstoppable. With Byzantine control weakened, Anatolia began to open. Not through one decision, but through movement. Turkmen tribes began to enter the region. At first as raiders, then as settlers, then as communities. They did not leave. They stayed. They built. They adapted to the land. Villages formed. Routes changed. Power shifted locally. Over time, Byzantine authority became distant, less present, less effective, and a new reality emerged. Anatolia was transforming. Quietly, but permanently. Meanwhile, Alp Arslan returned to campaign, maintaining control, managing expansion, securing borders. But his time was nearing its end. Not in glory, but in suddenness. In 1072, while on campaign, near the frontier, Alp Arslan's life ended unexpectedly. There was no grand final battle. No legendary last stand. Only an abrupt end to a powerful reign. But empires do not depend on a single life alone. They depend on systems. And Alp Arslan had built one. His successor was his son, Malik Shah I. Malik Shah I. Under Malik Shah, and the continued influence of Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuq Empire entered its golden age. Administration expanded. Cities grew. Education systems developed. Trade routes stabilized. But the foundation of all this expansion was built earlier. Built during the reign of Alp Arslan. Because his legacy was not just territorial. It was structural. It was transformational. The Battle of Manzikert did not simply defeat an army. It changed the trajectory of an entire region. It opened Anatolia to new settlement patterns. It reshaped political boundaries. It shifted cultural identity over generations. And it marked the beginning of a long historical transition that would shape the future of the Middle East and Anatolia. Alp Arslan is remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a turning point, a figure whose actions created consequences far beyond his lifetime. Because some leaders do not just rule history, they redirect it. And Alp Arslan was one of them. Long after his death, his influence remained in the lands that changed, in the empires that followed, and in the world that was never the same again. If you understand this story, You understand a turning point in history. Not just war, but transformation. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe and turn on notifications for more cinematic history stories. Because history is not only what happened, it is what still shapes the world today. And there are always more stories waiting to be told.